what is it that we can learn from each other is often missed.
Well, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks.
So good to see you.
It's fun to see you.
It's so cool.
Cool space.
Yeah, this is fun. This is very fun. I like seeing everybody in person again. Seeing them across the table. It's really fun. What have you been up to? I think, I don't know that I've had an update about Sara Jones in a while. Tell me what you've been up to.
Yeah. I have just been, let's see, I would call it deepening my practice. So meaning, in diversity, equity, inclusion world, there's sort of stages that companies go through, and I would say layers of depth that you're able to go through, if that makes sense. And so I think what I've been really focusing on and have the opportunity to do with a number of clients is to go quite a bit deeper than we've been able to before. And so that means getting to think about experiences differently and, getting much more deeper into the behaviors and really into the work that they actually do rather than for the work to kind of sit on the surface, if that makes sense. So hopefully that visual is kind of helping folks kind of understand you can go quite deep, which has kind of been some of the worry about DEI folks is like, oh my goodness, are leaders and employers willing to kind of do the work, right? And so it's not every client that's going to be able to go deep, but it's been fun to take some clients through, deeper and deeper layers. So
it'd probably be useful for you to tell people what the company is, what the practice is, and how you started it. And I think that whole genesis is actually really cool. Yeah,
I have been really passionate about diversity, equity, inclusion my whole career. And, for a lot of us who started, I've been in my career almost 25 years, right? So when you have been there that long, what you found is your work typically was not well supported, right? You're typically, one of the only, and you're trying to kind of drive upward change, which is really hard kind of from that grassroots. And back then the dynamics were so different, it was like, not in corporate. It seemed like there was this, corporate kind of, when I say corporate businesses, right, kind of resisted diversity, equity, inclusion to really kind of come into their workplaces. It seemed more of a nuisance, if that made sense. And so now, though, with everything that's happened over the last 5 years, there's been this dramatic shift. And I actually started my consulting firm, InclusionPro, before the pandemic, not realizing sometimes you're in the right place at the right time, And so, I actually thought I was going to lose my business. It was a small business, right? Like all the other small business. And I was thinking, I guess I'll be thinking of some other things to do again. And, for better or for worse, the work picked up quite a bit. And we've been able to, I would say, reinvent the space in a way that it's sort of like I've always wanted it to happen, because every time I was, doing DEI work, I'd always think like, gosh, but this is what I'd really want to happen in my ideal world, right? And so you'd always think like, what would be your ideal, but it was never quite possible. So now it is actually possible. And so that's what's so fascinating about being a DEI practitioner in this time is we get to bring in all these practices that people would never have done before the pandemic. And it's really actually exciting from a creativity, from a, from sort of a, invention level. I don't go in just saying, well, let's just do all the old stuff we did before the pandemic, right?
Right.
We get to say, hey, guess what? Nobody's actually nailed this.
Yeah.
So what is it that's actually going to create your culture and let you go deep in the way that's authentic to your organization? So having those kind of conversations, you can probably tell it's a lot more energizing.
Yeah.
It feels a lot more productive. It feels less finger pointy. So there's been some really cool just experiences that we've been able to create because of that open-mindedness that now exists.
So when you take on a client, is like the whole company your client? Is it an executive? Is it the executive team? How does that work?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's a client that the company that will hire me. So I'm typically working pretty closely, again, in the ideal world, pretty closely with the executive team first, right? Starting with CEOs, sometimes board levels, because that strategic alignment up top is so critical for that success across the whole organization, right? And we know of course, you talk to busy executives all the time,
Sure. Yeah.
And I've been an executive, there has to be sort of the right timing in place, the right way to kind of work it into what are arguably very busy schedules, right? And they have most leaders have traditionally seen a version of DEI that feels like I'm forced to do this or I have to do this, right? And so we really work to make sure it's, brought in a way that makes a lot of sense for where they are in the organization, is kind of the natural next evolution of where they want to be, because most organizations, they want to do it, right? I actually, if a client comes in and says, hey, we had this really bad thing happen, we need DEI consulting, I'll be like, actually, I don't do that. Which is kind of surprising, right? Like, who wants to turn down money, right?
Yeah.
But I don't do that because it's not, the mindset isn't right. Right. Yeah. I don't want to be that person like, hi, somebody really messed up here. So now you're all going to have to spend, time going through this training. So do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah,
when
for sure.
Getting that right mindset is so critical.
Starting it well before anything like that even happens.
Yeah. And sometimes, it requires leaders to kind of look at their culture and just acknowledge, what is it that we think we can do better? And those can be uncomfortable, right? Those are always, challenging as a leader because you want to do the right thing. And then when you're like, so we spent a lot of work right there up front, really better embedding DEI. And what is it that you really, what's the vision you really want to create for your organization? Because without that vision, right, it just feels like we're doing it because we have to do it, right? But if it's really embedded within who they want to be, how they grow, their business growth strategy, then it's actually really exciting, I think, as an executive to be part of that process.
Yeah, that's super interesting. So now, this is the fascinating thing about your world that I've always wanted to ask you, and I'm going to ask you with cameras on.
Okay.
Like when the term DEI gets said, like half the country is just like, screw that, right?
Yeah.
Like it's become like a political thing. I don't know if it's screw that. I mean, I don't have the words for it. But like it's actually a pretty heated topic now. And like to the point where like it's being talked about by people who are running for president.
Yeah.
On both like I'm for this or I'm against this, right? And so it's become like this political hot topic. Why do you think that happened?
Well, let's separate out two concepts. So DEI itself was never intended to be political, right? It was, it's a practice within an organization and kind of a lens. So if you think about, those watching, if you think about a learning and development professional, L&D, right? It's a specific area of practice. And what they do is they really try to apply ways of bringing in learning within an organization, like training, skills, leadership training, and things like that, right? So it's actually a practice. L&D is the title, right? Now, there's nothing scary about that. That's actually really wonderful. DEI is just the same thing, right? It's an area of practice. You're really helping people bring that lens in order to help them, work better as teams, be more innovative on their product set, really rethink about market share and all of those really great things that are great for business, right? So the challenge, though, is that that DEI itself has a very personal aspect to it, right? Because it's about identity.
Yeah.
So it's one of the areas within corporate that has a lot of emotion tied to it. And that's why it's actually one of the hardest areas of being a practitioner, because you're trying to help people understand the strategy, but sometimes the emotions get in the way, right? So what we're finding now is politics itself is starting to pick up on ways to trigger people's emotions, right? Now, I have plenty of sessions where when I ask for feedback anonymously, I will often get, someone, and I don't know their identity because they're just, responding to an anonymous survey, but they'll say, thank you so much for not making that political.
Oh, good.
Right. Which is interesting, right?
Interesting.
Because you can absolutely do DEI without it, you know, being about politics. And we're struggling, I think, as a nation to separate the two. And we're allowing, you know, certain people, you know, outside of our industry to tell us what DEI is in the workplace without really understanding what DEI actually is in the workplace. And this is where, you know, Utah's an interesting case study because we're seen as a very conservative state. And I think the misperception of DEI is that if we, apply DEI in any way, shape, or form within our organization, I have to change who I am. And it's that people assume is what we're asking people to do. Instead of saying, well, inclusion is actually, right, allowing people to be who they are, bring the best parts of you to work, lift each other up, but let's, you know, work on the things that tear each other down and reduce productivity, reduce innovation, and those sorts of things, right? So sometimes that means when I am, you know, working with a client and I ask about if they've got, let's say, an inclusion committee, I'll say, who on your committee is representing the majority voice, the conservative voice? Do you see what I'm saying? And that sometimes surprises people because they're like, oh my goodness, I didn't think about that.
Yeah.
Right? Because we have assumed that it's, you know, liberal, whatever, you know.
Yeah.
But I had one client who their organization is quite liberal. They will say that. They will be very proud. And they had this aha moment. Just because we're liberal doesn't mean we're inclusive. So do you see why really understanding what DEI is really important?
Yeah.
Because in our organizations, right, we are going to have lots of different types of people in the organization. And the goal is inclusion and to the best extent possible, trying to be equitable.
Yeah.
Right? But not necessarily changing who you are at the core.
Yeah.
And your belief system. Like, so a great visual that one of my clients said is bend toward each other, but don't break. You know?
Yeah.
So that's the human dignity, respect.
Yeah.
But I'm not expecting you to believe how I believe.
Yeah.
But it's the respect and dignity piece, right?
My sense of it is the division is over the definitions. I think there's probably, they have completely different definitions. One side has a completely different definition of what diversity, equity, inclusion is versus the other. And I want to get to that. But as you were saying that and talking about like politics at work and who's representing the conservative voice, liberal voice, that type of thing, I wonder what your reaction was to like Coinbase banning politics altogether, and Basecamp did it. And these tech companies like out in Silicon Valley were saying like, you know what, we're just out. And there was like both a positive and really negative, again, like a divided reaction to that. What is your take on that?
I always just think that's a shame. I feel like it's about skills. And when we are telling our employees, you know, you're not allowed to talk about X, Y, and Z because you don't have the skills to keep it from affecting your working relationship, right? Because that's really what they're saying is like you're arguing so much that you're saying, I won't work with that person. And that's a shame. So instead of, you know, sort of saying that's off limits, it feels like we could focus more on, well, what are the skills that they need to learn or we need to reinforce or train on? So I've had plenty of conversations where one of the exercises we do actually is we reflect on the skills of, you know, when's the last time that you had a meaningful conversation about politics, religion, ethnicity without the intent of trying to convince each other that you're right. Think about that conversation. What was it that made that conversation so meaningful and powerful? You know, and it's really about the skills, the environment, and setting it up so you can have a really, I think, rich conversation. And you both leave, or whoever's in the group in that context, right? You're both leaving going like, wow, that was so fascinating and interesting. I'm so glad we had that conversation. That's the human connection component that I think you lose out on by saying you're not allowed to have these conversations. It could be religion. It could be, do you know what I mean? But I think it goes back to if we had the skill sets to be able to have those conversations without going to like emotion level 10, we'd all be much better off, right? Dial it down.
Yeah.
But
my sense of it, again, like when Brian Armstrong, CEO of Cohen, this is a couple years ago, they banned talking about politics in the workplace. And, as I understand, there was like a lot of Slack arguments. It was probably around an election year. It was probably around the 2020 election when this happened. So there's all these Slack arguments, that type of stuff. And he's like, you know what? We're just building a crypto exchange. Yeah. Like, I don't know that this is even the appropriate venue to talk about any of this stuff, so let's just stop talking about it. So what would be your response to someone like that who says, like, you know what, I love all of that. Yeah. And I think people should be able to talk politics however they want, and, but not when you're at work building a crypto exchange or whatever they're building. Yeah. Do you know what I mean?
I think that's totally fair, right? Because at that point, it becomes a productivity issue of we're spending more time arguing over politics rather than actually working, which is what you're paid to do. And so I'm certainly not saying, to not consider productivity. But what I am saying is that, when you create the right experiences, you can actually open up for those types of conversations, right? And ways to create meaningful, understanding. And sometimes in the workplace, there's space for that to happen, right? As you're doing your team bonding, you're building your, DEI for me isn't necessarily just training. It's many times we go in with really thoughtful experiences that go way deep, and people leave having like, oh my gosh, I really understand that person so much more. That actually contributes to productivity, right? So finding those, it's like having a hackathon, at a company. You're not going to do it all the time, but there's a place to have these meaningful experiences with each other. So, just teaching, I think that's a productivity training issue as well, right? It's like, hey, we need to stay focused on building the business.
Yeah, the best outcome is like you build a connection with that person and with your coworkers in a way that, you wouldn't have otherwise had you not had the conversation. The worst outcome is you hate that person. And now you can't even work with them, and it becomes, so it's really interesting. Yeah. But I want to get to the definitions because I genuinely believe that those who are against DEI, and even maybe those who are for DEI, have two completely separate ideas of what these words mean. Yeah. So I don't know, like, I hate to do, but like, can we go through the three words and just like, what do they mean to you? And when people are thinking about them, they hear the word DEI and they probably hear their definitions, right? And so I'd love to hear yours. And like the first one, diversity. How would you define that?
Diversity for me, sometimes you'll hear it as diversity as a fact, right? It's just identity characteristics. You are who you are, right? I could define you in 30 different ways, Clint, right?
For sure.
And you as a person compared to, a group are a highly diverse individual, right? You add to the diversity of a group. So diversity is, beyond identity characteristics. I also bring it into world views as well, because a lot of the division we're having is simply a difference of worldviews. And that diversity, its true definition is the difference between worldviews. It's not like I, Sarah, am the diversity in the room because I'm Asian and a woman, right? So I'm not the diversity. It's I have a different worldview than you do, Clint, because my life experiences collectively, right?
Exactly
have driven me to view the world a certain way. You view the world a certain way. You and I, over the decades, have had lots and lots of conversations, and we haven't always agreed, right? It's so really that's kind of the core of diversity to me, and I think it's sort of been morphed a little bit to unfortunately be seen as a small group within an organization, and that doesn't serve us well, because then it's like, it invokes, we'll talk about equity in a minute, right? Because it invokes those kind of things. So I like to just keep it kind of simple of it's really the differences of worldviews, and when you have these collisions, you can either connect or you can conflict, right? So you have those choices, and how you choose to navigate those moments. That's the essence of inclusion, right? Equality and equity.
Yeah, I think the most controversial one is this one. I think the most controversial one is equity.
Yeah.
How would you define equity?
Well, let's go through inclusion first. Just as a foundation. Because I take it in order because you kind of need to build to that. Inclusion for me is, it really is a behavior, right? So I am going to, solicit your ideas, get feedback. It's asking for those contributions and thoughts of the folks that you're working with. And I, will remind people you can be inclusive without a group being really diverse. Right. So you can have a really, optically homogenous group working very well together because they're very like-minded. Right. So those potentials for conflicts, right, on the worldview conversation we just had, those are lower. Right. And so they're actually quite productive. Right. And so when you diversify a group, you start to add like all these new worldviews, right? That's where the leadership skills come in, right? Oh, I'm going to hear different ideas. I'm going to hear, different perspectives. They might not think the same way I do, right? So that's the inclusion skill right there. And then equality is, really about establishing, the same rights for all people, right?
Well, just real quick, when you say DEI, is it equality for you or is it equity?
Well,
are those the same things?
No, they're not the same thing, but I think you have to distinguish the two, right? Because our world, the way we've kind of grown up in business has been, I need to treat everybody exactly the same because we're so afraid of discrimination.
Right.
And there absolutely are, baseline to avoid discrimination. But the fact is on my team, let's say we're working on a team, I don't treat everybody exactly the same.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, it's kind of logical, but it's like, it's like in your family, right? It's like, we didn't all get treated the same, And I think that's just kind of real life, And so equality, has come to mean this like, equal shares, equal everything. Yeah. And I just think that's really hard to implement in a workplace and in any sort of group environment, right? But so I really kind of establish it down to creating really the same rights and that the same opportunity. But, you can have different outcomes, right? So here's an example. I do a lot of work on adoptee citizenship, right?
Which I love.
Yeah, for the listeners, there's some international adoptees that are older, my generation, that don't have automatic citizenship. The younger ones do, who are 38 years or younger. They got automatic citizenship when their international adoption was processed. But the older ones sometimes fell through the cracks, and they have to go through the old naturalization process. And it's usually they don't have money, and
it's probably a nightmare.
It's a nightmare. Sometimes some of them 20 years to get their citizenship, and
so
they were raised in the U.S. with U.S. citizen parents, believing they were U.S. citizens. So that's a great example where we all believe, for example, in the right to vote, which would be equality, right? This is this fundamental premise that our nation was founded on. And so when I tell people, like, did you know that there's people like me who are adopted, speak English fluently, my parents are white, that don't have U.S. citizenship, they're shocked. So that's an example of where we all believe in the right to vote, but the reality is not everybody actually does have the right to vote. So while we aspire to this wonderful human right, we actually need equity to make that right happen. Right. So that's a very simple example where I think if you look at that example, it's like, of course you want to fix that. That's just ridiculous that people are adopting children from other countries to be part of their family.
And they're not citizens.
And they could literally have a biological
at birth
sibling.
And stuff, right? Or like...
As, infants. Yeah. But they could literally have a biological sibling with U.S. citizenship and then they don't. But the same parents, right? So...
that is fascinating.
But equity as a concept, so that's an example of where you need equity to create equality. So that's a very simple example. And law is kind of a little bit easier. But I think in the workplace, it's harder for people to envision because we're not like passing laws. What we are is we're trying to build a business, right? And we're trying to get revenue and sales and all of those things. And so I think some people have a hard time, well, how do you do equity in the workplace? What does that mean? So I actually try to bring it down to a very team-based example because when you think about like opportunities that you've had, you can start to define equity more in the sense of if I'm the leader of a team, I'm actually paid to help set everybody up for success. Mm-hmm. If I know somebody needs a piece of information to be able to succeed at their job, then equity is me making sure that they have what they need to succeed in their project, right? Otherwise, that failure's on me. So equity is really setting everyone up, I call it building pathways for success for everybody on my team, mm-hmm. right? So, well, then what might you look at, where you've received equity? So there's, many examples I can think of, which would be like, many people move into their next leadership role without actually ever being a leader before, right?
Yep. Oh, yeah, for sure.
That's equity. You're being given an opportunity.
For sure.
You've never proven yourself yet in that role.
Yeah.
But somebody gave you that chance.
Yeah.
Right? You've written about giving people chances, right?
I'm a big believer in chances.
So that's equity, right? Another example might be if I'm a leader that's able to see a strength that my team member has, but they can't see it themselves, and I coach that person to see it and then utilize their strength, that's a version of equity, right? Another example would be, making sure, let's say explaining a piece of information. So you think about venture capital world, right? Mm-hmm. Not just assuming that founders know the jargon, the terms and things like that, right? Equity is helping them understand the language so that they can be successful in being able to get the checks that they're wanting, right? But sometimes that language, the venture world can feel like a foreign country. For sure. And you're like, what are these terms, So oftentimes we get stuck in the way people are talking about equity outside. And, again, these words can be morphed and twisted in different ways. Yeah. Some people think equity is giving something to someone they don't deserve. So when you think about your team-based environment, that type of definition doesn't make it really doesn't have a place in an organizational setting, right? Because you're there, you're hired, you need to get the job done. Everybody deserves to be given as much support as they can to be able to succeed at the job that you've hired them to do, right? So part of my leadership should be understanding, if Clint's on my team and Clint needs a piece of mentorship that's different from, Consuela, I'm going to be the kind of leader that says, oh, you need different types of mentorship instead of...
You both get the same mentorship.
Or none. Or none. Figure it out.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's the way I try to first approach equity in the workplace, because oftentimes, people disconnect it so easily, right? And when we think about like DEI in the workplace, traditionally, it's usually come from HR, and I'm going to do an initiative and a program, and then everybody's going to be like, oh, it's the HR program. But your HR leaders are not managing your teams. It's not actually their job to get the best thinking, the best ideas, the best creativity, productivity. It's not HR's job. They're there to support you as a business partner. It's my job as the team leader, right? And oftentimes we forget that those skills of valuing all of the great skills we have around us, diversity, right? Engaging those skills, but also what is it that all my team members need to succeed? That's actually on that leader, and that's actually what they're paid to do. So if you can be that leader, you get the value of the productivity, right? Innovation, things like that. So if we can just apply, so now you start to see their applied skills that show up right in our work instead of this. And now we're going to have the DEI training outside and disconnected with building a crypto company, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah.
So I tried to the best extent possible to really help people see these as very relevant tools and lenses that they can apply right on their teams on a daily basis, rather than this big academic exercise that may or may not feel relevant to them.
Yeah, I think when you think about the other side who has this visceral, and I still find it so fascinating, that's such a visceral reaction to these words, in particular equity. I think what they hear is equality of outcomes. And what I just heard you say is equality of opportunity.
Yeah, it actually goes, I think, a little bit deeper than that, Clint.
Yeah. Well,
let's talk about
tell
this,
me.
because I've been able to work with thousands of folks, and I actually think it comes down to more of a personal, so if you take like, you've shared your story, right? I've shared my story. And, most people have had to work really hard for what they have, right? And I think there's a fear of saying, well, don't tell me I didn't work hard for where I've gotten. So do you see why DEI can be intensely personal?
Yeah. Oh, for sure.
Right?
Yeah.
And so,
yeah, for sure.
So depending on how you approach it, it can feel like a personal attack on, like, some people worked hard, they made sacrifices, and I can understand why it can feel really hard for them to hear, yeah, but, we need to give supports to other people, and in here you are having, worked your tail off, right?
Yeah.
And sacrificed, or maybe not seeing your family.
Yeah, sure.
And things like that. So I think that's probably the big challenge, which is why it's so important for folks to understand how equity showed up in their own personal career. Because without that, right, that understanding and the empathy isn't completely there. Do I feel like I could have received more equity in my career? Absolutely. But I can also point out many and thousands of different examples of where somebody gave me a lift up, somebody helped me along, so, right? None of us got into where we are by ourselves.
Absolutely.
And so I think it's really that is not like taking this conversation so personally that you shut down and say, well, because it's not like this contest of who's working harder. And I think that's, do you know what I mean? It sounds so basic and but we're humans, and that's the funny
exactly
thing, right? We go into this like territorial, like defensive mode, and we want to fight, flight, or freeze, right?
Yeah.
Is that the three things?
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Right? And we go into those modes instead of like this creative learning mode. And that's, taking people from that state to this state. That's the art of DEI.
Yeah.
Right?
That's hard. It seems like it's hard. I mean, it's dividing our country.
Yeah, if we allow it to. And that's where I think it still comes back to skills for, I you know what I mean? And I hope that we can all, kind of see what's coming up in the next couple of years, that it's going to be tough, and really encourage each other to not buy into the division. So let's say we need leaders on all sides, right? It's not like this side's going to convince this side. We need people on this side to work with each other, say, hey, is that really what's best for our country? Is that really what's best for our state?
Yeah.
Is getting rid of our DEI offices in higher ed helping or hurting?
Right.
Right. So that, I think those types of conversation really can actually only come from their own group, right? On the other side, right, is this approach really helping or hurting, right? Is there a better way to build a bridge? And I think it's those bridge builders that we need to teach people that skill, right? And there's a few folks I think do that exceptionally well. But I think, again, it's really having that leadership to show and model, like, this is how we do it. Now, Utah actually does a fairly good job, if you think about it, for being such a
interesting. How so?
Republican state.
Yeah.
There's been, I think our state, because of our relationships and because of, I don't know, we have this interesting independence as a state, even though we're Republican, right? Or supermajority Republican. Sure. We have this interesting independence where I think we don't always feel like we have to, just kind of follow the crowd. And I think that works to our benefit. So we allow ourselves to think differently about, like, refugees, immigration, right? We allow ourselves to really think carefully about how is the economy going to be, our state economy going to be impacted, because we see the potential for, and we have been surpassing so many states. So we're actually really smart and strategic, I think, as a state. And so it's not just a given that because there's like a hot button issue that we're automatically gonna Just follow it, right? And that's actually really great. And that's been the work of so many, I think, leaders, political business leaders in our state to really, try harder on common sense solutions. So, for example, with Governor Cox, asking for more immigration where the conservative right is actually trying to shut it down.
Yeah.
Right. That's an example of where we can have some independence of thought because we know there are, it's good for our state, right? Our unemployment rate is so low.
Yeah.
Right. And so, it's fascinating to watch and to sort of, I try not to get too deep into it, but I've had enough experiences where I get to see just a little bit of.
No, I'm fascinated because this is your world. This is what you do. You're an expert in this. Like you have a whole company.
Well, I don't do policy.
Yeah, no, but that's this type of thing. So my question to you is, and I think you've done a really good job of this throughout your career, is like, where do you pick your spots on when you're going to get public, or when you're just going to stay out of the debate, right? Because we could all be in debates all day long. And where do you decide, like, here's an issue I'm going to focus on and actually speak out it?
Oh, that's a great point. Some of it has to do with my own emotional capacity because there's so many issues, so many things I could be speaking out on. Mm-hmm. But I think part of it for me is my career has been based much more on business and strategy. And so blending in the right amount of sort of social activism has been a learning for me as well, because for me to be able to do my best work, I actually need leaders to trust me to bring them into their companies. So I have to be very careful about alienating leaders or finger pointing or making them feel like, oh, I'm going to like come out publicly and speak out against you, right?
Yeah.
I can do my best work if they are able to bring me in and we can work on, these skills that we've been talking about to help their organizations be more unified, because that division that you're talking about, it seeps within the organizations.
Yeah.
Right? And it shows up a little bit like this. I think the folks that want change, they want it to happen very, very quickly. But as a practical matter, anytime you're taking an organization from one state to another, that actually takes quite a bit of time, and it's not actually really fast. And I think that's the misconception that people have when it comes to DEI work, is that you can, have this change overnight. It's usually not possible because you have to take a whole organization through that. Meaning, so think about like all of those emotions like rolling around, right? You got to take a lot of people from that, fear, anxious, unknown state into, oh, I get it. I understand it. We have a unified definition. We have a unified vision, right? That can take some time. So sometimes the division even happens with folks who are progressive being like, it's not happening fast enough. And yet I'm sitting there saying, yeah, but we have this percentage of people that have actually engaged, and that's actually amazing, right? We don't want to leave them behind. We want to bring them all, as many people as we can, into what inclusion actually looks like at this organization. So you have to kind of carefully manage those pieces, because otherwise you don't want that, that resentment to start to percolate,
From like a community perspective, and I'd love your take on this. Like the tech community, I don't know, we're not great at the political stuff, like when to use our voice or when not to.
Yeah.
And if some of that, maybe I'm not great at that. Right? that may just be like a personal thing that I'm saying. But my sense of it is, we built this thing. Everybody who was part of the tech community and built all these companies did it kind of completely outside of interacting with legislatures or caring about what bills were passed and things. This is my sense of it, right? Yeah. And now people care what we say, right? Whereas like in 2014, they didn't really care what the tech community had to say, right?
Yeah.
But now, 2023, they care about what we say. And it's interesting, like, how do you balance that because like we're not a monolith, in the tech community, there's all different views and affiliations and all that type of stuff. And so, you'll put out something like, a good example of this is, I don't know why I'm talking about this, but we might as well.
Yeah.
We announced Elder Bednar.
Okay.
David Bednar to come speak at Silicon Slopes Summit in September. And it was fascinating to watch that from my perspective of like why I invited him, like why we thought he would be a good speaker and all that type of stuff, and how it was perceived on both sides. I mean, that was a really interesting issue for us, or for me personally, when I'm looking like on Twitter and there's like 50% are like defending us, like and defending us like to points where like that's not even why we invited him.
Yeah.
Right. And then the other one is like really attacking us. And again, like that's not even why we invited them. Right.
Yeah.
And so it's really interesting. Like, how do you keep a community strong? Like, because like, I mean, one thing you could say is like, hey, just never have any divisive or figure ever do anything. But then we're not learning is kind of how I feel. And like, particularly like when you're talking about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, like the most powerful organization in the state. Right. Like we just push them out like that's where I struggle, like from a community organizing perspective. You've done this so well with, women tech counts and all this type of stuff, is like, how do you can't actually speak for the entire community, and you're going to get things attributed to you, motivations that may not actually be true, right? And so how do you deal with that?
What is it that we can learn from each other is often missed. And I think as an organization, as a tech community, I think, again, it really comes down to your vision and mission.
Yeah.
Because I think this is, what's kind of interesting is, like the LDS Church it's a huge tech organization. I think people don't think about it that way, right? I've seen the behind the scenes on their tech and their buildings. And if you think about the amount of data and the amount of infrastructure they have, they really, in Women Tech Council, we like to say, every organization's a tech company, right? And they have massive groups of engineers. They have lots of products, technology products.
Yeah.
They've been instrumental in DNA matching and family searches and things like that. So,
they own the biggest media company in the state. They own KSL.com.
And they need all of the, supercomputing. They need the fast, video. The broadcast of General Conference alone.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point.
Is just a really fascinating just case study of how technology enables them to have global reach. And so this, again, I think is where, when I'm working with organizations, if they really understand their mission and vision, the messaging is so much more clear, right? You're not there saying we are supporting every ideology of the LDS Church. You're recognizing that they are a technology organization just like so many, and they're one of the largest employers in the state of Utah.
Yeah.
They may know one or two things about our economy, right? And one or two things about, massive organizational design, right? And so those are, I think, from a strategy and learning perspective, to your point, those can be very useful, but it often gets lost in the politics and seeing, that invitation be more of a political move rather than, the LDS churches. If you think about from an employee base, I mean, it's the size of a Fortune, 10 organization.
It's an enormous,
right?
Yeah.
And if we had any other,
it could be more than Apple. We don't know. Yeah,
if we had any other CEO, right, coming and talking about their organizational design and tech and how do we get stuff done with tech?
Yeah.
I mean, wow, you'd have 50,000 people show up. So, so I think that's where, really alignment around vision, mission, and making that very clear to people can really help because, again, in organizations, you will have conservative people that work there. It's a fact. I mean, and you're not trying to push them out.
Yeah.
Right? You're just trying to make sure that those working relationships are productive and not destructive, and that, you can create cool things together. And there's no reason you can't.
Yeah.
Right?
And by the way, I don't know if it was the right decision. Like, still, I never know if we're making the right decisions or not. I just kind of go by, like, how do I feel about this? and then, reach out to as many people as I can, and then we just make a decision and keep going, right? Like, I've been shocked about, and by the way, like, we're not used to people caring what we do, right? Like, if we would have brought Bednar in 2014, no one would have cared, right? It wouldn't have meant anything, right? That platform doesn't exist all of a sudden, right? But that one in particular was fascinating for me, just as, Silicon Slopes over here. In the response, because we've done a lot of controversial things at Silicon Slopes, as you know, like stepped in controversial things or done controversial things, whether intentionally or unintentionally, right?
Yeah.
That I've never had a reaction like that. Like I was literally getting death threats, which I didn't even think was like a real thing.
Oh, I'm
right?
sorry.
No, yes. I mean, then obviously it all goes away after 48 hours.
No,
but like,
it's scary though.
Yeah, it's weird. It's really weird.
I appreciate Troy Williams' leadership from Equality Utah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he's great.
Where he has been very vocal in these behaviors that really can build bridges versus the ones that continue to fester this division. And I think more leaders need to really work, kind of take that tone, because I think, the canceling, all of that stuff, it doesn't bring people to the table.
Yeah.
Can we actually influence positive change for folks, and, like any large organization, they're going to be slow to change. It's hard, right? These large organizations,
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know enough about that situation.
No.
To
yeah, I mean,
really
like
adequately comment.
We probably make the wrong decision more times than we make the right decision. I have no idea.
But I think that speaks to the reactivity, where we've got to kind of move past that reactivity. And it's two sides. When George Floyd was murdered, you saw a lot of corporate get really reactive. Mm-hmm. Right? Training, head of diversity, without actually the proper foundation and being informed and equipped to make, a meaningful, decision. I think on the same side, when we're reactive of, well, why did you do that? Instead of having that calling you up, saying, "Hey, Clint." I mean, I don't know how many people call you. You probably had a lot of people call you up and text you.
Oh yeah. Like, there's that, like people and then there's like people I don't even know, like leaving kind of like crazy voicemails, which is really interesting. But sometimes we bring it on ourselves. I mean, again, I didn't think I would talk about any of this stuff, but we put Senator Lee in the Silicon Slopes Hall of Fame. That was, by the way, not nearly as controversial as having Bednar come speak at Summit. So that was fascinating. Like, we've done things that are obviously like, hey, you're going to get a reaction.
Yeah.
Do you want this reaction? Is it important for you? Does it align with your values? And we go with like our gut and say like, yeah, it does. But also there's a whole community here that is part of Silicon Slopes, and it doesn't align for everybody's values. That's the really fascinating thing about building a community. What have you learned, like through Women Tech Council and being the incredible community builder you are, about how to navigate, like the best way to just have like a really strong and cohesive community?
Yeah, and just to be very clear, I'm not on the board of Women Tech Council anymore. So
sure.
Anything I share is not speaking for Women Tech Council. But I think just the ability to listen and just understand where someone's coming from. Everyone, I mean, I've had thousands of people share stories with me of all genders, right? All races, all, identities. And I just find the more I learn, the more fascinating humans are, right? Yeah. It's not like, I don't look at a white man anymore and be like, oh, you're a monolith. I'm like, oh, there's depth, even in a community that is assumed and sometimes maligned as not being very deep, right?
Yeah.
And we're all having these human experiences. And when you sit down and you listen to somebody's story, you're like, oh my gosh,
Yeah.
And I'm a speaker coach actually for TEDx Salt Lake City this year, so super fun. That's just a fun, passion project for me.
By the way, quick plug: everybody should go watch your TEDx. When did you do that? Like 4 or 5 years ago?
2019, I did a TEDx Salt Lake City talk.
Beautiful. Everyone should go check that out.
And it was featured on TED in 2020. It was a dream.
It's very cool.
It was amazing. But this is one of the reasons I love just doing that, is that one-on-one and learning someone's story. Mm-hmm. Because beyond their talk, there's this whole why you're passionate about this. There's this whole set of life experiences of why you ended up talking about this, right? And when you just get to listen to somebody's journey and what they've gone through, it's just, I think our levels of empathy just, amplified, increased. And it's hard for me to look at somebody now and just see them as a pure bad human, right? And it's just like, look, we're all just kind of a mix of good and bad, a mix of good and bad experiences. There's nobody perfect.
Yeah.
I don't care who you are.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
And so I think just trying my best just to like make those personal connections and make people feel seen.
Yeah.
I don't always have to believe the same as them, but if you feel seen, that's very different.
Yeah.
And I think it's that people. We just did a roundtable for Utah Business earlier this morning, and they were saying the Surgeon General, one of their biggest concerns right now is actually the lack of connection. Is one of the biggest health risks, right? And so I think this division is contributing to that, right? But if people feel seen, we start to kind of like bring people back together as it's just kind of as humanity, right? Because we're all just kind of a mix of humanity. So I think that's the thing is just, I'm appreciating one-on-one relationships much more as I get older. Maybe it's an age thing. I don't know, because like you, right? You get into a community and you're meeting thousands and thousands of people and sometimes it feels like you can only get to that surface level, right? But gosh, I really appreciate those deep dives. That you get to take with people when you just carve out that time and spend that time with them. I just think community is about where can I help you succeed? And what was kind of fun about this roundtable we did today is I got the opportunity to say, hey, here's a bunch of people I think would be additive. And what was kind of cool is they represented like religion and veterans and disability and ethnic chambers. And, so there were corporate people, and there was just kind of like this great mix of people, and everyone had something to contribute. And there was people in, doing policy and things like that. And I think when you see a community as this rich, like, mosaic of people with all these skills and talents, that's super cool to experience. And I think that's what keeps me energized. But it's being able to see somebody's skills and talents and say, okay, here's where I can help, you succeed a little bit, nudge you or whatever. Sure. So that's just kind of been my thing, I think, in community is there a way that I can help this person succeed? I don't know.
I like what you said about them needing to feel seen. And like people, because early on, I'll be honest, by the way, like I'm probably one of those people like, no one would ever hire me to be the CEO of Silicon Slopes. I had to like create it in order for that to happen. No one, I wouldn't be like I wouldn't be a finalist for like the chamber CEO or any of those types of things, right? And so I'm learning as we go too. And early on, when we'd get in some sort of country, and they were smaller back then, right? But the community wouldn't agree with something. It was like I just immediately dismiss it. That's not my motivation. I'm just out. And I don't even like hear their point of view. All of a sudden I was just out, right? Just dismissed it. And so they didn't feel seen. And now I have learned, like when we've done the two controversial things I just mentioned, particularly like the Lee and Elder Bednar thing, like I've been really, really, I've really tried to hear and really understand that point of view and like why they say that and that I don't dismiss it as quickly as I used to. In fact, I don't dismiss it at all now, which is really interesting.
I think the more you understand what's going on in someone's world, the more you're able to take the emotion out of it. So like Senator Lee's office, I've been working really closely with their office on the Adoptee Citizenship Act. I spend time with lots of their team members, their legislative directors, state directors, and things like that. They're wonderful people, right? They're available, they're responsive, they listen. And the more time I spend and just learning and understanding, all of the different things that, someone like Senator Lee is dealing with on the national level, as well as, it it is a tough job, right?
Yeah.
Like, I mean, our landscape is very, very complex.
Yeah.
It actually, the more I actually understand sort of, the world they live in, again, the world views, the more I'm able to be like, okay, all right, and kind of, maybe not be as annoyed as I was, I guess, before. Yeah. But that's really, again, me taking the time to build those relationships, spend time getting to know their staff people and things like that has been really eye-opening. And I wish more people had those kind of experiences so that they could realize, like, most of our legislators aren't bad people. They're just in a really tough job, trying to keep, make policy. It's hard. It is a tough job. And there's a lot of reasons why I would never want that job, right?
And particularly if you're a community builder or a community organizer, like somebody like Senator Lee, I couldn't tell you what he voted on, like his voting record and stuff. But I can tell you, like, man, he's been amazing for Utah's tech community. Right. Mm-hmm. And he's been there and he's, helped got Mark Zuckerberg here, which was a huge moment for our state to show the world that, hey, we're a, viable tech hub to the point where one of the biggest CEOs in the world is coming here. And then the biggest CEO in the world with Tim Cook coming here, like those types of things. Like he's really, and like, it's hard, but then you get into a broader conversation and debate that really has nothing to do with any of the things you're talking about. Right. We're in an interesting time.
We are. It's complex. It's nuanced. Yeah. Right. And it's I think it's really testing us as a society on, whether or not we can really, work towards the interest of everyone. Mm-hmm. Right. Instead of kind of go into factions or go into, some horrible movie around, factions or whatever, some dystopian, kind of world. But I think that, if Utah can't do it, who can? Yeah. Right.
Yeah. How do you think, what do you think the future of Utah is? How do you think this state looks 15, 20 years from now?
Well, gosh, we still have some geographical differences in ethnicities. Our fastest growing area, region is still predominantly white. Mm-hmm. And so I do think we need to really think thoughtfully about, how we're bringing in our local talent. A lot of times we, companies will come to me and they'll say, well, I really want to work on hiring for, let's say, ethnic diversity. I'll say, where are you located? They'll be like, oh, I'm in like South Jordan, Riverton. I'm like, you happen to be right next to a neighborhood that's minority majority. Like, do you know that? Do you realize that, like, your organization, and getting past some of our myths, Utah's 1 in 4 people in Utah are ethnically diverse. A member of an ethnic minority. I don't like ethnically diverse, but a member of an ethnic minoritized community. And we think 1 in 4, right? Yeah. And so we have to kind of just think thoughtfully, like, we might not be reaching all the talent we could be, and it feels very logical and obvious, but I think sometimes we just say like, yeah, but it's Utah. And then we just kind of throw up our hands and we give up, And I think the thing that the community builders in Utah know, probably more than anyone, is the work of community. It is a lot of work, intentional work, to know all the different people that make up the community. Yeah. Right. And it's a lot of work. So I just don't know any other way to say it. Yeah. Right. If you're not willing to put in the work, then you're just gonna just attract the talent that you attract. Yeah. But if you want to change things, then there's so many people here to help you do that. Yeah. Right. We have these type of conversations. We know exactly where to direct you. Yeah. Right. And so that's the great thing about Utah is there's some really well built up communities, that have been at this for decades and decades, not just since the pandemic.
Yep, exactly.
Right?
Yep.
And so we are quite mature that way as a state, and I think a lot of people don't realize that.
Yeah.
Like I was down at BYU doing a student thing, and there was this student who's Polynesian, and they're like, I'm one of the only ones in my company. And I said, well, luckily for you, there's, a Polynesian like tech organization. It's like, there is, do you know what I mean? So there is, anyone who wants to find community in any way, shape, and form. And there's some that are really based on affinities, but there's some like Silicon Slopes that aren't, Women Tech Council that are more based on career, occupation, and things like that, right? There's I think a place for everyone. So that's what I think is fascinating is we have some of the most liberal people in Utah. We have some of the most conservative, right? And we coexist together in this kind of weird, funky way, right?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the important things in this whole conversation is that we have conversations like this. So how incredible for us and for our community and for everyone who's listening or watching to have heard your perspective on all of this. I thank you for doing that. Again, I don't know. We didn't have a plan on what we were going to talk about, but
no,
I think that
it's always just fun to spend time and talk with you, Clint, and just, what's on our minds right now, right? Because it feels like, the Silicon Slopes, if you think about like all the years we've been doing this, it's in constant evolution, right? And so there's always like the next, what stage are we at right now, and what do we need to be thinking about? Yeah.
Sometimes we're going backwards, sometimes we're going forward. Thank you also for your leadership in this community. I mean, you've been a rock for me personally and for the Silicon Slopes and tech community. It really means a lot to me. You're one of my heroes. You're somebody I look up to as like a really great community builder and leader. And thank you for that.
Well, thanks. It's been fun. It's been fun to see the evolutions and you and I were both learning on the job. I hadn't done a nonprofit before. You hadn't. I think we're all learning on the job. And that's actually the beauty of, I think, skills is that it's really unlimited what we can learn. Yeah. And so, specifically with diversity, equity, inclusion, I don't ever go in thinking people can't learn this stuff. I think everyone can learn. And that's, I think, when we just kind of keep it focused on that and our human potential, right? I think that it's really unlimited. We can do some pretty amazing things together. So thanks for having me.
I agree. Thank you for coming.
It's been fun to talk.
Okay.